Good morning, everybody. We're going to make a start now and let people join as and when. So thank you very much indeed for joining us for our second webinar in this 10-part series. We're going to be looking to raise some awareness around legal and regulatory changes and some industry best practices, tools of the trade, and right at the end, we're going to be answering any questions along the way. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Sarah Crane. Sarah's our vastly experienced customer support manager with a whopping 14 years of background screening experience. And Sarah's stepped in to keep me to task today and help me manage the interactive polls and the Q&As. Morning, Sarah.
Morning, Dave. Thanks very much for having me.
Great to have you with me. Thank you. For those who haven't met me before, I'm Dave Cole, a DC to most people. Been in the background screening world for well over 20 years now, in all sorts of different roles for all sorts of different organizations, but delighted to be hosting this 10-part webinar series I mentioned. Let's just move on to the next slide to talk through what we're going to be covering today. I'm going to be starting with a bit of background around the BPSS standard. I'll provide an overview of what's included and then go into a deep dive of the requirements. I'm going to be talking about how to stay compliant. I'll give you some solutions for some of the challenges and share some top tips and best practice guidance as well. Now, there are going to be some polls throughout the webinar to gauge some understanding and awareness. Please do feel free to post any questions throughout the webinar. Sarah and I will answer as many of these as we can during a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So poll number one, I can see some responses. We've got quite a lot of people saying that you're not familiar at all with the new guidelines, which is clearly why you're here today. So that's great. And some that are very familiar as well. Begs the question, what are you doing? But thank you very much for attending anyway. As I say, this one is really just to gauge, who I'm talking to, what level of detail we need to go into. And I can see that 75% of people have already voted. So bearing that in mind, we will kick on with the show. So what is BPSS and why are we talking about this today? Well, the Baseline Personnel Security Standard, BPSS, a lot of people ask me what that means. It ensures organizations are employing individuals who have the right to work with the honesty and integrity required for working with and or for the government. So BPSS was introduced as a replacement for BC or basic checks back in 2006, and it was first published in 2014, which is when most people first became aware of it. It was updated again in May 2018. That was the last update until it was updated at the end of June this year, just a couple of months ago. And BPSS is, of course, the prerequisite to all levels of national security vetting, which means it's the minimum level of checks that are required for all persons that have access to government assets or data. Now, the standard has been widely adopted by a lot of firms outside of the public sector, so private sector organisations that are either working with or for government on contracts, or they've just accepted BPSS as a good baseline of background checks to get the ball rolling. I've been in the industry for many, many years, and it's staggering how many firms don't do any background checks at all, or they don't take them particularly seriously. So it's been a good step forward for those who really weren't doing much in the vetting space at all. Now, I was hoping for some serious reforms, but there really just have been some modernizations involved. But the purpose is obviously to mitigate reputational damage to you as an employer, particularly governmental vetting, as you can imagine, to help combat identity fraud. Fraud is, of course, the biggest crime in the UK by a country mile, and anything that we can all do to mitigate fraud has to be a good thing. Prevent illegal working. This is, of course, a legal requirement for all UK employers. To detect CV lies as well in a variety of different ways, people falsely representing themselves, and the idea is that vetting should help mitigate against that risk, but perhaps most importantly, to prevent loss of sensitive government information. Now, really, this is just a baseline. As I say, I wanted greater reforms, but these modernizations do move things in the right direction. So I think as a baseline, follow the standard, tick the boxes, but please, please, please don't take this as best practice. It's a minimum standard, nothing more than that. There's so much more that should, in my opinion, be included. But fundamentally, BPSS vetting is there to protect us all and the public person by vetting anybody with access to government data assets, or at least to this bare minimum of standards. So what does BPSS entail? The key components haven't changed at all. Right to work, identity verification, criminal records, and employment verification. That should be familiar to each and every one of you on the webinar today. And of course, EBC can support customers and prospects with all of these elements. But as with most things, the devil with vetting is in the detail. So let's just take a deep dive into what are required for each of these components. So identity and right to work checks. These are absolutely crucial. You've got to get these right because there is literally no point vetting anybody unless you're certain as you can be about their identity. And not to mention the risk of up to £60,000 fines for hiring each illegal worker. Now, the requirements have been updated in line with new processes and new technology that really came about through COVID and the pandemic. But as you can see, for identity verifications, digital identity checks are now accepted, and there are strict guidelines in place for the manual identity document checks as well. You need to obtain a countersigned passport photo and signatory statement when the guidelines cannot be met. So there are some people who can't provide identity in line with the requirements. It could be for a number of different reasons, but there are caveats in place where these exceptions can be utilised. Now, I've highlighted this because it really is important, but you must also obtain evidence of current or permanent address. There's an annex to BPSS which details what documents are permissible for being accepted as proof of address. A driving license is obviously a key one if it is updated. HMRC records can be accepted as well, Department of Work and Pension, benefit statements, etc. Council taxes, utility bills, financial statements. But of course, there are caveats around when you can accept these documents as well. But a big thing to note is, of course, with everybody moving online for statements and bills, etc., these online statements are acceptable now as well. Of course, when it comes to right to work, there are three options for employers. The traditional manual physical check and face-to-face with the candidate is still obviously accepted. The digital checking service for persons with British or Irish passports, and of course for non-British or Irish citizens there is the share code route. So each of these three options is now available and permissible for BPSS vetting. But beware the imposter check. You do not receive a statutory excuse against civil penalty unless you as an employer have satisfied yourself that the person in the digital checks, whether that's the share code route or the digital ID verification check, if you haven't satisfied yourself that it's the same person that you were looking to on board, you don't have that statutory excuse. So please make sure that that is part of the process if it is not already. We'll jump into the criminal record checks and the employment verification as well. So criminal record checks are now mandatory. There was a caveat before that allowed portability of criminal record checks from department to department, but the caveat now is that you can only accept a criminal record certificate if it was issued within 90 days of the vetting commencing. And that means that you can't just take as read, oh, this person's already been DBS checked or DS checked, and you don't need to do it again. You absolutely do. So typically the standard will require a basic criminal record check, whether that's from Access NI, from Disclosure Scotland, or from the DBS, but are of course going to be roles where the eligibility requirements are different, and either the standard or enhanced would be the appropriate level of criminal record check there. But why do they do it? Well, it's to establish whether the offence or any offences that are returned on the certificates would cast doubt on the reputation of the individual or the organisation, and whether or not the offence is relevant to the role. So a criminal record certificate that contains adverse information is not a barrier to employment. Bear that in mind. You must still stick to the Recruitment of Ex-Offenders Act and all of the good meaning and intent behind that act. We'll talk a little bit more about this a little further down the line. It's a very important part, but yeah, just bear in mind that criminal record does not mean barrier to work. Definitely not. And changes to the employment referencing piece. Big change here is that they've really clarified what is required when it comes to gaps. Very wishy-washy in the 2018 standard, but it's now a 6-month period, be that cumulative or continuous, that needs now to be evidence. They haven't stated what evidence means, but we can again talk about that in due course. So cumulative or continuous, hopefully that's self-explanatory, but if that's a one period that's 6 months or more, or whether it's 3 periods of 2 months or more, for example, they would need to be verified as part of a compliant BPS vetting. Fabulous introduction in terms of modernisation of background checks is that BPS vetting now allows HMRC PAYE verification as confirmation of employment and activity. So you've still got that minimum 3-year activity period to verify, but you can now officially use HMRC online records or the paper equivalent, the printouts, as evidence of employment. But again, the whole reason of doing employment referencing as part of BPS vetting is to minimise fraud, review gaps, and identify any conflicts of interest. Hopefully that's self-explanatory, but please do drop any questions in the Q&A tab. There's a little drop down with a speech bubble as options to start discussions or post a question, and if you use that tool, we'll get to those at the end of the session. So those were the 4 key elements, but there are some additional considerations that I really wanted to go through today. Some caveats, if you like. So let's just quickly run through these. International criminal record checks. Another big change of the standard is that, thank God, character references are no longer acceptable as proof of activity during any 6-month gaps overseas. Criminal record checks must be obtained from the police or from the ministries of justice, whatever the case may be for the country in question. But they have to be obtained now for any periods of 6 months or more. Very sensible addition to this iteration of the standard. Identity and UK right to work checks, just bear in mind that these particular elements have to be completed before you can initiate any levels of national security vetting. So for those organisations that can apply for CTC, DV, whatever levels of national security vetting that you require, you have to have these 2 elements completed, even if the criminal record checks and the activity verifications haven't been completed. The other key thing is that in terms of data retention, you must retain proof of identity and proof of right to work throughout the entire duration of the employee's tenure with your organisation and for 2 years after employment has ended. So please, please, please bear this in mind. It's the same for all organisations, but it's just very clearly stipulated in the BPSS guidelines. Now, this one only applies to government agencies and departments, but last year, the Public Sector Fraud Authority launched an internal fraud hub. It's a database containing tens and thousands of civil servants who have been barred for working, dismissed for fraudulent offences. Obviously, it sounds startling, but there are hundreds of thousands of civil servants, but used to be very easy for staff to be dismissed from one government agency and find work with another without the new agency being aware that they've been dismissed for fraud. So for those of you who are familiar with SciFast checks, it's pretty much a SciFast check, but for government departments and agencies only. So it's basically a blacklist. Anybody on there will stay on the internal fraud hub database for 5 years after they've been added to the database. But it's only available to the organisations. It's not something that your vetting companies will be able to assist you with. So time for a quick poll to see how things are going. Let me just launch that one, bear with. So poll number 2, as you can see, is which aspects of BPSS 2024 do you think that you will find most challenging? Slightly different. This one you can click on the options and rank them from most to least challenging. It'll be very interesting to see how everybody responds to this, and I'm sure it's going to be different depending on your demographics and employee pool, but there are some likely candidates. Hopefully that's all updating in real time for you all. Interesting. Very fascinating results. Looks like identity verification is the key challenge for organisations, employers at the moment. Least challenging, criminal record checks, no surprise there. Very standard and familiar process for a lot of organisations. Employment history verification, so referencing, going to be that challenge for organisations, no surprise there at all. But hopefully the HMRC element is going to facilitate that. So without further ado, let's move on to the next slide, and it's time to jump into helping organisations meet the compliance requirements of BPS vetting and making any adjustments that you may need to apply to your vetting process. So first and foremost, obviously all vetting processes need to be completed in line with Data Protection Act to ensure data protection and privacy, and that's front and foremost of all vetting. They do stipulate that vetting must not be used to screen or sift out candidates before the offer of employment is made, so please make sure that that fits in with your recruitment flow. Caveat here for turnaround times for the overall vetting process. Very similar to the security screenings requirements, vetting must be completed within 3 months of employment commencing. This enables government to bulk hire teams of workers for whatever requirement that is. They can start work as long as the identity and the right to work elements have been completed, but you've got up to 3 months to complete the criminal record checking, gap checking, and employment and activity verifications. If you can't complete it within 3 months, though, that employment must be terminated and go through the process again. Already mentioned that you can accept DBS or DS certificates from previously sourced records. So if the candidates applied for one themselves, for example, or if an agency has sought one on their behalf, you can accept it as long as you've received it within 90 days of that issue date. They also talk about within the standard where rechecks are necessary. So I really wanted to focus on this. So if an employee is transferring to another organisation, this is pretty much interdepartmental within the government, but can be applied within any organisation, obviously. There could be checks that needed to be reinitiated or topped up. Same applies if somebody is returning to work. If they've had a gap year, you don't need to reinitiate BPSS. But if that has gone over the 12-month mark, then BPSS needs to be repeated. There's also obviously that caveat about individuals who don't have indefinite leave to remain. So if they've got restrictions on their working visas, you do have to repeat those checks. And they also talk about the need for continuous monitoring of people without indefinite leave to remain. So use technology where you can to be reminded of expiring visas is the key to this part there. And of course, if there are any changes to somebody's name or their personal circumstances, could be gender, could be all sorts of different scenarios there. But if there's something significant there, then checks may need to be repeated or done afresh, particularly if you're doing repeat checks, be that rescreening or ongoing vetting. Bear in mind the changes in personal circumstances. They also state in the standard that any additional background checks must be both proportionate and lawful. Now, I've talked at length already about how this is just a minimum standard, those 4 key elements. There are plenty of checks, plenty of roles where additional vetting would be hugely beneficial to organisations and agencies. And we'll talk about that in a little while. Again, this is a little known quirk with BPSS vetting, but there is a big focus on collaboration. Now, they talk about how it's vital that HR, security, legal and compliance teams, where applicable, work together when it comes to vetting. And it also stipulates that security teams, where applicable, should assess the criminal record check results. And again, they specify that this needs to be the case where BPSS is administered by HR. So it's a crucial part of the process, and the messages don't have a single point of risk or failure. Share that burden of responsibility and regularly check or audit the quality of your BPSS files as well. And of course, they do mention that the entire screening process may be outsourced with the appropriate risk assessments in place. And of course, that's key and part and parcel of what I was talking about in terms of regularly checking the quality of BPSS reports with robust audits. So some common challenges and solutions. I'm going to dive into each of the elements here, talk through what challenges you might be facing and what the potential solutions would be. But the key is to be flexible, I think, when it comes to employment history. Use the technology that's available when and where appropriate. And, don't be afraid to resort to evidence gathering where needed. I'd say that referencing and references in general are on a steep downward trajectory in terms of both reliability and effectiveness, but also due to turnaround times as well. I know for a fact you're lucky to get job titles confirmed in some sectors now. Firms like Google and Apple have taken the initiative of, I say initiative, it's counterintuitive, but they've stopped providing job titles in employment verifications or references, as they are sometimes referred to, for fear of litigation. They'll literally just confirm that an associate was employed from a start date to an end date. And I think a lot of organisations will be very lucky to get anything more in a reference nowadays, unless, of course, there's a regulatory requirement to provide further detail. So with that in mind, obviously, they've opened up the opportunity to accept HMRC official records to help confirm somebody's employment. And they do stipulate that it is an either or. You do not have to do references if you are obtaining HMRC records. But of course, if those HMRC records are missing or ambiguous, you can't just take that as read. You've got to be flexible. Use both. Take a hybrid approach. Try and get references where you can, but use HMRC verifications where it's going to expedite things, provide the verification that you need. Identify hidden periods of employment. That's always a really good reason to adopt HMRC pay-as-you-earn checks. Hybrid document collection, and of course there is that caveat that you can accept digital verifications as well, so you're not looking for hard copies of exit letters or contract. Digital verifications can be accepted as well. Just going to talk about ID and right to work now. If you've not gone digital yet, my question to you is why not? I mean, there are huge benefits with terrific success rates. I think most organizations can expect to see around 80% of digital right to work verifications or identity verifications go through instantly and successfully, or almost instantly. Obviously, share code will generate some delays to the process, but it's still a very quick and efficient process. But it does mean that you don't have to do those face-to-face checks with 4 out of 5 candidates on average. So huge benefits there in terms of resource saving as well. So for the few pounds that it costs to pay for the checks, you'll get back in spades with all the resource savings, particularly not having to get the candidates to come into offices, all the travel expenses, etc. So all in all, it's just a great thing to do. So if you're not doing it already and there's any benefit to your organization, do consider doing digital identity and right to work checks would be my strong recommendation. Address verifications. Now, as I mentioned, I think this is one of the big failings of a lot of firms when it comes to BPSS vetting. Don't overlook it. It's a crucial part of the BPSS process, and it's the thing that catches many employers out when it comes to compliance. So how are you addressing this now? Do you need to make any changes? I've mentioned Annex A already. It's there in the standard. It tells you what can be accepted as a proof of address document. Obviously at EBC, we can support this in a number of ways. We've got our fabulous customizable forms, templates that we can create to make sure that all the guidance is there for the candidates in terms of what information and or what documents they need to upload, and clear guidelines can be provided as well. So really neat way of facilitating that process. But bottom line, you have to take and retain proof of address in the same way that you do proof of identity and right to work. So last but not least, international criminal record check. So as this is a new big change to the previous iteration from May 2018, you have to be obtaining these criminal record checks, police letters, certificates, etc. from anybody who's worked outside the UK for 6 months or more in that last 3-year period. I've got to be honest, international criminal record checks are the most challenging aspect of all vetting. There are language barriers, legal constraints. Can you get it? Can you use it in different countries? There are all sorts of different scenarios that make it a real minefield. And of course, the quality and content of information provided can be hugely variable as well. And also bear in mind that unlike in the UK with filtering rules, you might get far more information back on a certificate or police letter than you would in the UK, or vice versa. They might not tell you anything. They might make a judgment call based on the period of employment and not tell you about somebody's criminal past. So it's something that you really need to be cognizant of and familiar with. But of course, the guidance is that candidates can self-serve. They can get their own criminal records certificates or police letters from almost everywhere in the world, or you can use a third-party supplier to facilitate that process. Of course, the benefit is that it's far less risky in terms of fraud. If a candidate is self-serving, then they could doctor the information. And my recommendation is if you do get candidates to self-serve, then verify the authenticity with the issuing body as well. So make contact with the police force that issued it or the ministry, just to make sure that anything that looks suspicious or you're not comfortable with is verified before you just accept it as part of the vetting. Interest of time, we've got to shoot into poll question 3. This one, as you can see, is about the whole concept of instantaneous employment verifications. Again, a little bit of variance here. 80% of you are comfortable with the use of these verifications. That's great. Only 2 out of you are quite uncomfortable with using them and will only use these as last resort. That's good. I'm interested and impressed with the results there. It really does bode well for the future of this great initiative. So quick recap just to make sure that we have enough time for Q&As at the end. ID checks and right to work checks have been enabled digitally, so make the most of those. But obviously make sure that you're getting results from certified IDSP solution. Now, you don't have to be an IDSP yourself as long as you are using a solution that is certified, as is the case here at EBC with our right to work and ID checking solutions. The introduction, of course, of HMRC employment verifications for verifying employment as an alternative for referencing, big change there. Clarification around gap periods, cumulative or continuous gaps, just bear that in mind. Any periods, track it, see if there's a 6-month window that's been unverified, and if they are, go and get those verified, evidenced in line with the requirements. Of course, the mandatory requirement for DBS checks now, and of the portability limitation of 90 days certificates that have been issued. The elimination, thankfully, of character references for time spent overseas. Obviously worthless in the grand scheme of things, because nobody is going to give you details of somebody who's not going to corroborate your story as a candidate. And of course, the fact that these international criminal record checks are now mandatory for that 6-month window within a 3-year period. So that's a summary of the key changes. In terms of tips and best practice, I really want to talk about 3 things here. The need for HR policies that cover employment screening. It's staggering how many organizations I speak to do not have a pre-employment screening policy in place at all. If you don't have one, get one. If you need help, talk to us. We can help you with this, but it's crucial part of the process. It just ensures that consistency, avoids discrimination, and helps you as an organization make effective hiring decisions, which is what it's all about. It's also that point of reference to share with candidates or employees in the event that they question any decisions that have been made. So it really does cover your backs. I mentioned this before, but please do consider embracing digital identity checks and right to work checks if you haven't done already. This really is a game changer for many organizations in improving the candidate experience. It's so quick and slick and much better than doing those face-to-face checks. You can't possibly expect HR staff or even security staff to be experts at document checking and spotting frauds. Let the technology do all that for you and help combat identity fraud in the country. Obviously, immediate results, auditable process, records that you can store for those 2 years post-employment. You can keep compliant as well. Now, of course, the third key thing my recommendation would be to adopt the HMRC instant employment verifications using PAYE solutions. It's something that we're launching very soon here at EBC, and as I say, it's going to be a game changer for our customers and their candidates. It's going to speed up those BPSS vettings and other regulatory vetting standards immeasurably, and it's a very seamless process. They won't know that they're going out of the candidate vetting form. Those who've never used the government gateway before, guided very seamlessly to activate their accounts and provide those results without any challenges at all. The next thing I really want to talk about in terms of best practice is around conducting alternative verification and assurance checks. I talk about this at length. Baseline just being the minimum requirements. Tick your boxes to say you've done it, but if you want value from a vetting, then consider the additional checks. They're not going to all be relevant for all roles. Bear in mind the effectiveness of things like credit checks for anybody with access to cash or financial data or banking facilities, driving license checks for anybody who is driving either company vehicles or driving on company time. There's the Corporate Manslaughter Act, which should be at the back of every organization mind. Make sure that they're insured and they're not banned from driving, or they're not at risk from being banned as well. Those people with 9 points in their license might not be in a position to carry on their work if they're to get another speeding fine, for example. International fraud and sanctions, should be there as a minimum standard for most organizations, but the big value really is in those politically exposed persons checks. That's something that can change all the time by marriage or all sorts of different factors, affiliations, friendships. So doing regular fraud and sanctions checks with that PEP aspect is incredibly valuable as well. And for me, the big one is social media and online reputational checks. They've been introduced in so many different standards, but not in BPSS yet. It's something that UK Gov are still looking at. They understand the importance and value, but it's not mandated just yet. But do it. Consider them. They're incredibly effective and efficient. But in the interest of time, we're going to have to just launch one final poll and delve into the Q Q&As as well. It'd be great to see how you handle your vetting and compliance internally at the moment. So whilst that goes on, I'm going to hand over to Sarah to go through the Q&As.
Lovely. Thank you, Dave. That was really interesting. So I've just got a couple of questions in here. So if you finish doing the poll, you've still got time to squeeze some in. So the first question we've got here is for international criminal check. Is that for addresses within the last 5 years? So no, it's within the last 3 years. That's what the guidance states. You just need to be looking at the last 3 years of address history.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is only the 3-year window that they need to look at. But I would say for best practice, if somebody has indicated that they've lived outside the UK in the last 5 years, then as best practice, do the international check as well. Belt and braces, wherever there's the option to do more to add value, I would certainly recommend it.
So thank you for that question. And then the other question we have is the post office verified right to work acceptable? Yes, it is, because it got done through a verified IDSP provider that 100% meets the requirements, that uses all of that great technology. So yeah, you definitely can use that. We just had one last question squeezed in as well, and that's from one of our current customers who are aware that we're going to be building an integration with HMRC. So this will mean that our system will just pull the HMRC records, obviously with the candidate's consent, which will be a great feature and will make the employment verification parts of this very, very simple. So we are working on this. We're hoping that this will be released in Q4, and that will make your whole employment verification much easier if you do choose to use the HMRC route. So if you're not a customer and you're interested in that, please do reach out to us. We'd be happy to have a chat. That was all the questions we had, I'm afraid, Dave.
That's great, and thanks for handling those as well. As part of the wrap-up, let you know what we're going to be talking about in a few weeks' time. The next webinar is going to be on the 10th of October at 11 o'clock again, and the subject will be understanding BS 7858. So for those of you not familiar, this is the industry standard for the UK security sector, or for any firms that are adopting that standard for working in a secure environment. It's not just for security. So if that's going to be of interest, we'll be sending out links to register via emails and on the socials within the next few days, and look forward to seeing anybody who's going to join us again then. But for now, it's an on-time completion to the webinar. Thank you all so much for joining. Great to have you with us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Make the most of this glorious weather in the end of the summer. Thanks, Sarah, for helping me out today. Thanks again to you all for joining.
Thanks,
Goodbye.
everyone. Thanks, Dave.